Yes, well, first I wanted to say thank you for this invitation to give a presentation at this conference. I have to admit that this is actually my first time in Latvia and also as a participant of this conference, and it's been really interesting to hear about all of the presentations and about all of the different perspectives. This is very new to me from this side, so thank you for this. It's actually given me a lot to think about already. And as said, today I'm going to give this presentation on factors influencing forest practitioner management objectives and activities. And before I start diving into things like what is a forest practitioner, I want to preface that this presentation and its outputs represent a collaborative work between 3 EU research projects, namely Forest Paths, Forwards, and Holy Soils. And all 3 of these projects have work packages that are invested in advancing the knowledge of forest management, especially from the perspective of the forest practitioner. So there are many researchers involved in these 3 projects because they're very large EU Horizon projects. But in particular here, I just wanted to highlight some of the individuals who directly contributed to the work in this presentation, is particularly through data collection across many different European countries. And some of these people are here in the audience today, and you can actually probably even ask them for additional information if you have questions later. You could probably do that. But as for me, I'm Dr. Florencia Franzini, and I am a social science researcher for the European Forest Institute, and I'm leading the task on researching all of these perceptions from European forest practitioners. And just so you know, my background is actually in forestry economics, but I was originally a marine biologist, so surprise. So yes, maybe a little bit of background about the research. As a starting point, I did want to actually define here what we mean by a forest practitioner. So we define forest practitioners as agents with decision-making power over management decisions of a forest land. And this includes the really quintessentially obvious private family forest owner, but also other private owners. So this can also mean other legal entities like foundations and companies. In addition to private ownership, you can also classify people as managers of organizations that make management decisions on behalf of either a private or a publicly owned forest. And to clarify that, I think the most obvious one that would come to mind is maybe somebody that works for a public forest agency. But a less obvious example might be someone from a private organization that manages land on behalf of a private legal entity. So for example, a company that manages forest land for a foundation or even a very large family-owned, large-scale like industrial private forest. So practitioners, they include a lot of different kind of people. And you might be wondering why it matters and why we make such a fuss over all of these distinctions. But the truth is that it's really important to consider these variabilities among practitioners to understand how the groups differ. And understanding differences is sort of key because we know that forest management decisions, they impact the availability of forest-based ecosystem services tremendously. And we live in a moment in time where society's reliance on forest ecosystem services is incredibly multifaceted and sometimes even at odds. We also understand that management decisions are not made in a vacuum, and in fact, this is true of all decisions. So there's a need to comprehensively gain knowledge about what influences forest management decisions and what shapes these decision-making processes. So from the perspective of the project, I also want to just preface that another large motivation is also to specifically understand decision-making processes that contribute to our understanding about how forest practitioners take up what we call climate-smart forestry practices. But I admit that even though that's an objective of this research, I'm not going to go into that in this presentation because it's a lot of extra things. But just so that you know, if you're unfamiliar with the term climate-smart forestry practices, these are kind of management activities that support climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation of forests. So I just put this out there to give you a frame of reference for this study. And maybe the last thing that I want to share is that, yeah, this is coming from the work of Forest Paths Project Deliverable 1.2, which is publicly available online, but it is not peer-reviewed, so keep this in mind. We hope to submit a manuscript, but until then, this is all in some ways kind of preliminary research. So now on to the fun stuff. I don't want to overburden you with methodological explanations of what we did, so I really just wanted in this slide to kind of summarize this three-step overview that tells you what are the research questions of this project, how we collected the data analysis, and what kind of outputs we got from this study. And basically, the meta-objective here is to improve knowledge on factors and processes influencing forest management decisions. So the research questions are really simple. What objectives do forest practitioners have? What management practices do they actually implement? And what factors influence these activities? And this is very straightforward, but the process of answering these questions is complicated because we're not testing theories here. We're dealing with qualitative research, which means that we're scoping ideas. And we approach this research then qualitatively through interviews, which means that we need to design a special interview protocol that everybody follows. And the protocol has to help us answer the research questions. So we give this protocol to several people across Europe to do the interviews for us, and then they send us back transcripts in English, and we analyze them, specifically using this method by Schreier called qualitative content analysis. And all that is basically that you are developing a coding framework, which is a list of frequently occurring topics found across the research. And you basically have like a major category, and then underneath you have nested minor categories. So think of a list that says something like 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, 2.2, so like this. And the goal of this research is to create this coding framework that helps you answer these research questions. And typically that means that you find these categories and these themes from your data. So what you do is that you really go through your interview transcripts line by line, and you look for reoccurring themes, and you categorize them, and then you subsume them, and then until you end up at a final list. And the key here is that once you have that final list, you go back into all of your data, and you label your transcripts according to these different labels from the list. And the purpose of this is that then you quantify and you can really compare across the interviews where do things show up, what kind of activities, what kind of factors. And the power of this is that you can even begin to combine and see where things cross together. So what factors with what management activities. And I'm going to show you what all of this looks like. So maybe I won't waste too much time on this because I've taken up a lot of time, but this is just the interview guide, and it really was to just ask these three, just to figure out what are their forests like, what objectives do they have, what activities do they have, and what might be impacting in these activities. So very straightforward, and it's a standardized questionnaire. And then a little bit about who we actually did the interviews with. I think this is quite important because we conducted 19 interviews across 6 European countries, including Italy, Finland, Latvia, Netherlands, Romania, and Portugal. And the interviews were all very variable in terms of how you would classify the practitioner. So are they an owner or a manager? But also about the tenure and the ownership structure of the forest land. It varies a lot. So we had 11 different types of private family forest owners, but you can see that there are very different kinds of family forest owners. You had very large-scale family owners, you had absentee family owners, you have small family owners. In addition, we have 7 public forest managers, municipality level, national level, et cetera. And we even had a manager that was actually managing a 3,000-hectare forest on behalf of a foundation that owns that forest. So this really shows you there's a lot of different kinds of practitioners out there. And now I'm going to go and dive straight into the actual coding framework. So as a reminder, the coding framework, this list that we create, it's supposed to help you answer the research questions. So you can think of the list being in 3 parts, one for each research question, and that's what I'm going to break down for you now. So recall that our first research question was, what objective do forest practitioners have? So this portion of the coding framework seeks to answer that question, and you might notice that this is actually following on a pre-existing concept from the literature, which is the concept of forest ecosystem services. And this is the only portion of the coding framework where categories in the framework are actually adapted according to a pre-existing framework. And the reason why we did this was actually highly relevant, and it's because it's important to understand objectives rather than rationales that drive objectives. And when you see a typical survey to a forest owner that asks them what are the most important objectives, it will say something like provisioning timber for income, Provisioning timber for income. Income is a rationale. It's not an objective. The objective is provisioning timber, so that's forest provisioning, which is a provisioning ecosystem service. So it's very important to do this so that you distinguish between rationales and the actual objective for the forest. I think another way to think about this is that, like, who is to say that cultural objectives or regulatory objectives can't also be fulfilled for the purpose of income? We don't only do income of provisioning services, you could also technically monetize off of cultural services. A very common one is ecotourism, so for an example. So yes, I think this is a very good way of helping us to reveal what actual different ecosystem services are being produced as objectives. And what this means in practice, here, what this just shows you is basically the different examples that they gave of objectives. So cultural services were typically the preservation of forest for societal activities or historical purposes. So people would say, I have an area for recreation, I have an area for tourism, area for hunting societies, areas for family enjoyment, or maybe getting some Christmas tree, etc. Also the preservation of land for historical purposes or for cultural purposes. So you have some people that use forestry as a traditional way of carrying on their regional settings, for example, in Italy, cork forest production. So this is also about maintaining histories. You have provisioning services, which is really those tangible things, such as timber, berries, mushrooms, fuelwood, cork, and even husbandry in agroforestry. What we didn't see in these interviews, which I thought was really funny, was hunting and fishing for meat. You do see these as cultural objectives. People just want to have the land to do these things, but they never talk about actually provisioning for these things, which I thought was interesting. Then of course, you have regulatory objectives, and these were typically objectives that are associated with ensuring continued regulatory functions of the forest, like halting biodiversity loss or enhancing carbon sinks, things like this. So now I'm going to move on to the second research question, which is what kind of forest management activities are actually being implemented across Europe? And the purpose of this question is really to find those concrete management practices that are happening on the ground. And then the coding framework, we found 25 different types of forest management activities, and you could classify these into 7 broader groups. So you have different kinds of regeneration activities, so like types of species, material use, regeneration techniques. You have harvesting activities, so do they clear cut, do they do selection felling, etc. You have a lot of different conservation activities that try to preserve the natural environment. You have stand treatments that change the structure or the condition, things like fertilization, things like this. There are also what we call ecological controls. So this is like when you have a population control of wildlife. Then you also had land use changes, because there is land use change happening in the development of infrastructure. If there is deforestation or afforestation, that is a land use change. And then, of course, agroforestry got its own, because it turns out that agroforestry is a very unique and underexplored and underdiscussed topic, so it ended up in its own box. Then we have the actual factors. And this section is a lot to unpack, because there were 21 types of factors, which you can categorize into 8 broader categories. But all the factors are kind of complex. And so what we had here was, for example, personal values. So values about tradition, economic values, environmental values, utilitarian values. These are the rationales that people have that drive their objectives. So income, for example, is like an economic value. We also had one called organizational structure, and this one I was thinking about earlier during some of these presentations, because this is about how the choices or processes made within organizations, so think the managers, within their organizations, how that impacts decision making. And this topic only shows up, this category only shows up for managers, and it's something that we should think about more. Then you have resources, so maybe this is a bit obvious, things like time, money, knowledge. These can also impact your decision making. There were multiple governance mechanisms mentioned by people, so voluntary instruments, information agreements, regulations, that came up today a lot, but also market-based instruments and public processes. Then you had market pressures, so timber markets, non-timber forest product markets, and other markets. These can also impact the decision-making of the owner. You have a variety of kinds of normative pressures. So for example, public pressure, pressure from the public, forestry networks, they also create norms and pressures. Then neighbors can also impact what you're doing. And then public goods. This one was also just for public forest owners, or not owners, but the public or the state, that basically they react to the idea of public goods and people having access to goods. So I think here, maybe the example that was given in an earlier presentation was like every man's right. They have to think about this. In addition, you have two groups which you could call ecological factors. The truth is that disturbance regimes and the biophysical qualities of the forest also impact your decision making, and there's just no way really around that. So what I'm going to share here, unfortunately, it's not very clear because it's a bit small, but what I wanted to show you here was the actual, what happens, as I said, you take that coding framework and you apply it across all of the data, right? And so what you end up being able to do is basically create a tabulation for how often or if at all that label or that factor or that activity actually shows up in the interview. And you do this across all of the cases. And what this table basically does, how you read it, is that every cell in the table indicates that a unit of code was labeled, so a part of the interview was labeled with the respective management objective, which is on the row, and the respective influential factor, which is the columns on the top. And the values in the cells, they indicate the number of interview cases where this relationship is visible. And so what this means is that you can actually have a course overview and scan for saliency. The hotspots, so where you have very large numbers, this basically tells you that the factor shows up several times across multiple interviews with all management activities. And I highlighted these. So basically, these 5 factors, so resource availability, it impacts all management activities a lot across all of the interviews. The same thing with market-based instruments. The same thing with regulations, forestry networks, and biophysical properties. So these are what we call salient factors. They're very important for everybody, or at least, especially what you see here, but in theory, everybody, though there are ways to test that later we will discuss. So maybe I go back just to preface. So this is what happens when you make this, and this is for everybody, and you can see what are salient factors for everyone. But it's still important to talk about the fact that each interview is its own case. I mean, this is qualitative research. The interviews are very rich, and you need to contextualize this information against the interview to understand it. What you don't see here, for example, is that, okay, so there's a relationship between whether somebody takes up monospecies regeneration based on resource availability, but you don't know the directionality of the relationship between the factor and the activity. So then you have to look at the actual case studies. And since we're in Latvia, I thought that I would show you guys very briefly a summary of both the Latvian cases and tell you a little bit about them. So the first one is what I refer to here as Latvia Case 1. And essentially it was very interesting. It was a small-scale private forest owner, and they acquired 2 hectares of land during restitution, and about 30 years ago, they made efforts to afforest about half a hectare of the abandoned farmland on the property with pine, which means that their forest is really young. They have a little bit more, I think it's 1.5 hectares of forest land in total, but it's all quite young. And what's really important is that the principal objective for this forest landowner is that this forest land meet cultural objectives. This forest land serves as a home for their family, so they use it as a scenic retreat or for recreational purposes. They cut down like a Christmas tree there. It's about their family, it's about their tradition, it's a cultural objective. And what's important to recognize about this person is that despite the fact that they have a small property, they're not a passive forest owner. They do engage in management activities. And they take up a variety of different activities for different influencing reasons. So for example, they do wildlife management, where they get the hunting association that's local to come and hunt, not for meat, but because they need to have animal control. So it's a biophysical issue. They salvage log. They do this not because they want to provision wood, but because they need to reduce bark beetle outbreaks. So they're aware of, they have drivers and they're aware and they do manage their forest, but they're not interested in provisioning from their forest. They might occasionally engage in some utilitarian actions, like, yeah, they might pick up firewood while they're tending their forest, but again, it's not because they need to fulfill this thing. It's just that they do it because they're there and they're taking care of their forest in this way. So this owner is even opposed to like clear cutting. They really don't want to cut down their forest. So basically, they're primarily driven by their own personal values. So their value is to maintain this home and to conserve their home, their cultural objective. But they are also, as you can see, they do end up resorting to certain things, even though they don't agree with cutting down their forest. They will salvage log for biophysical reasons. So this means that there are things that do end up driving the decision-making process for this person apart from just their inner values, which would be to conserve this forest. In Latvia, case 2, we have a radically different case with 450 hectares of land obtained through 20 purchases over the last, since 2020, so 2002, so almost 20 years of purchasing. And they are primarily purchasing all of this property here in Latvia for provisioning. And they're really here for meeting income income to meet their income ration. This is like their driver, their income values. So, they have a cutting regime which is motivated by income. They do clear cutting. They know about selective cutting, and they say that they can't do this because it might not be economically viable for them, or because basically they don't have good machinery, they don't have good resources, or they don't feel that they have enough support from forestry professionals that could help them carry out these activities. So they're kind of bound by their resources in being able to take up more what some might consider more like environmentally driven cutting regimes. At the same time, they do commercial thinning according to their own expertise, because this person is also a trained forestry professional. So this is quite interesting. They really rely on their own resources to make their choices. But they do mention that they carry out a lot of different conservation activities, and these are actually cited to be a result of the fact that there are so many regulations that would require them to do these activities. So regulations also impact very, very highly what this person is doing, even though they never actually, this owner never actually expressed having any conservation values. They do carry out conservation activities, but that is because of regulation. So this is quite interesting to think about also. Ultimately, yeah, the summary is that this person, they use knowledge, they have economic values, resources constrain their choices, and that guides their decision-making, but regulations play a strong role. So maybe, because I don't have much time, maybe I will just wrap this up and say that if I was to compare these two interviews, we do see that there's different values that drive different objectives. So traditional values versus economic values drive different kinds of activities in the forest, especially in the harvesting regime. So one doesn't harvest, the other one clear cuts a lot. But the role of regulation is still important in both cases. And what I didn't mention here, I'm so sorry about this, was that regulation does come into play here because of choices in afforestation that this owner had to make. They were not able to do afforestation as they would have wanted in a more conservative fashion, what they believed was more better conservation value, because they had to follow the regulations in Latvia where you have soil quality that dictates what kind of species you might be allowed to grow on that soil. So this was quite interesting. So they also didn't really get to do what they wanted, but I can't state it whether if that is actually more or less of a positive conservation output, but that person felt that it would have been. They wanted to have monospecies, not monospecies, multi-species regeneration, but they were forced to do monospecies regeneration. So just something to think about. The other thing I'll just briefly mention is that what differs in this interview than all others, in Latvia from all others, is that there's no mention of continuous cover forestry, which is something we see in other interviews. And I think that that's also something to think about. I think I'm out of time, so I'm not going to really say anything else. But the key takeaways here are that what are the most salient factors, and that we see that values drive objectives, but structural factors still constrain these value-based decisions in the forest owner. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Yeah, there's more, but we're out of time, so I don't want to bore you guys, and just say thank you, and if you have questions, feel free to ask them.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Yes, we have got some questions. And one is about a specific group of forest owners, those owners who typically live in cities, not close to the forest. Did you find this situation and how this specific category impact forest management?
Yes. We had, I mentioned here, but it's very small, so I apologize. We had one absentee owner. They were located in Portugal, and it was a really, really, really interesting case. I had a lot of fun reading it, I have to admit, because basically this forest is in a part of Portugal with heavy fragmentation because there's a lot of urban development happening around that forest. And she only keeps the forest because basically it's like a memento for her mother that passed away when she was very, very young. Her father used to take care of the forest for her. Her father is still alive, but her father can't take care of the forest anymore because he's too old. So she doesn't know what to do. She's torn all of the time. Should she sell the forest? Should she not sell the forest? And basically, the only management activities that she does are those which are forced by regulation. In Portugal, you have a lot of wildfires, and it is a huge problem. So they have mandatory shrub cleanings and shrub clearance, and she has to do that. So she engages in that. She tries to get someone to help her or her dad to do it when he can. But she has been fined. She explains this in the interview that she has been fined for not doing it before. So it's very interesting because ultimately this absentee owner, which would do nothing with their forest, still does something because they are like the regulations kind of force them to. So it was a very interesting case. And I think her objective really with that forest is again, it's a cultural objective. It's about sentimental value. So that's my thought.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question, do you find similar hotspots over different regions in Europe, or are they the same or different?
That's a really good question, and I have to admit that it's something that I've been wanting to take a closer look at myself. Because this is still preliminary, as I said, I haven't really gotten a chance to break this down by regions. It's also very tricky because we only have 19 interviewees, and I was thinking about this today actually because, as you saw, we have 2 interviews from Latvia. They're both private forest owners, but I heard some very interesting things today about how municipality management happens in Latvia, and many of those concepts are missing from here. So it's very tricky to break this down by region because it's clear that there isn't equal representation of forest practitioners across the regions. So this might also create gaps. But that's why we are actually, and what I was going to share is that we did launch a very large-scale survey where we surveyed 13 European countries, lots of forest practitioners. We have about 250 responses from Latvia, and I hope that in the survey we can make better use of this kind of question and see regional differences.
Thank you. We have thousands of forest owners. How did you choose these 2 ones?
Yes, this was done by convenience sampling. So the demo leads, the people that we gave the interview guides to, it's at their discretion to decide who will get sampled. So it's purposeful in the sense that we did ask to try to find differences between the people you interview. And I think in this case, it was great because we got a very small owner and then a huge, like a very unique, I would say, situation. 450 hectares of private family forest is quite unique. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, and maybe we will see next year.